School can be tough, can't it? And as if school wasn't already tough enough, you are probably going to be asked to read some books that you are unprepared and ill equipped to truly appreciate at that age. And so, the topic of this video today is how should literature really be taught? Because, as I'm sure many people can attest, the way that it is taught in schools often does more harm than good. I know that has been my personal experience when I was in school. I enjoyed reading. I really loved books even at that age, but I recognized that that was perhaps anomalous because while I had some fun reading the books that we were assigned, um, I would wager the majority of the kids in that class alongside me probably had all their potential for future literary affinity just destroyed by the way they were subjected to books which they hated and which they were not yet ready to tackle. And so I have formulated some theories and I have some suggestions on how literature might be taught in a more beneficial manner and one more conducive to fostering true appreciation for literature. Now, first of all, we have to understand what the true purpose of literature in school is. It is not just to teach kids to love reading. That's not really the purpose of it, or at least not in full. Yes, they do want kids to love to read, but again, if they just wanted that, they could give the kids like a novelization of a film or a video game or, just a paperback thriller with lots of blood and guts and sex in it, and they could say, "Isn't this entertaining? Don't you like to read this?" But again, that's not really the point. The point is to teach critical thinking, to teach kids how to not only read the lines, but to read in between the lines and extract deeper meanings from texts in which they are not readily apparent. And I agree with that. That is, after all, one of the greatest things that literature can offer us. It can give us new avenues of thought. It can alter our perceptions about certain issues or things, subjects and topics, and that's great. So I agree with what they're trying to do. I just don't agree with how they go about doing it. That is where our opinions diverge, schools and I, because again, I think they do more harm than good. So I do agree that books taught in school should have something to say, should have something for the students to dissect. But one thing that I do not think that the teacher should do is force students to read books that they can't even understand. And by that I mean I'm talking predominantly about the language of the books, because language is one of the greatest things that you can come to appreciate about literature. I mean, language can have a true beauty of its own. It can take your breath away, but at the age of adolescence, you're not really prepared to appreciate that. And so when you're given something with archaic, old fashioned language that you have to have a dictionary just to, gain basic comprehension of, your ability to love that work at that age at least is probably going to be greatly impacted. So I do not think that um, the books that they teach in school should be written in a language that the students can't grasp at least relatively easily. And another thing that I think teachers should really take into account when teaching books in a literature class is that they should be at least somewhat interesting. Now, as we know as adults who love literature, that some of the greatest books of all time are really, really boring. I mean, at least, apparently. They have very little action. They're given over mostly to introspection and, character study as well as some philosophizing. And that's great. But when you're a teenager in English class in high school, you aren't prepared to appreciate that because the adolescent brain is geared towards speed and action, not ponderance and introspection. And so I think that uh, the books which teachers assign to students should at least have some measure of external action to keep the students engaged and to keep them, hooked. And that's not to say that books have to have that to have value. Obviously, they don't, because again, some of the greatest books ever are really, really boring. Like one of my favorite books of all time is Kate Chopin's The Awakening. And I mean, virtually nothing actually happens in that book externally. There, a lot happens within the characters, but as far as action goes, it is remarkably uneventful. And so, had I tried to read that book when I was 14 or 15, I would have hurled it across the room because it is really, really boring. At that age, when you're not prepared to really, appreciate what the book is doing and the subtleties and the nuance of it. So, I believe that the books that they teach in school should at least have some degree of action to them. So, the three things that I think they should consider when instructing books in school are that they have something for the students to dissect. It's not just a story. B, the language should be understandable to teenagers, and C, they should be at least somewhat interesting in an action oriented kind of way. Now, what I would like to do is give 3 examples of books that are taught in school that I do not believe should be, because I believe, again, that these books have the potential to do much more harm than good. But I would also like to give 3 examples of books that could be taught in school or are taught in school that actually belong there, that actually do what they should be doing. And I'll kind of alternate between one that shouldn't be taught in school, at least not by my standards, and one that should be. So, starting off, let's take a look at this book here, The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. Now, this is a really great book. It is beautifully written, and it has a lot to, unpack, to decipher, but it's pretty boring, actually. At least it would be, I think, to a kid. And since, as I'm given to understand it, I didn't actually have to read this book in high school, but as I'm given to understand it, this is popular in a lot of schools to assign for reading because it's pretty short, and that is, one of its saving graces in that regard, in that setting at least, is that it's pretty short. But I do not think The Great Gatsby belongs on the curriculum of high schools because while it is true that it is a remarkable book and it is, again, beautifully written, um, what it's actually about, I don't think most kids are probably going to be uh, ready to really appreciate or even interested in. I mean, it's about the roaring 20s and a strata of society that lives monetarily decadent lives, but lives that are morally bankrupt. Again, definitely a lot to pick apart here, but when you're a kid, I don't really think this book belongs on high school reading lists. So, The Great Gatsby is one that I do not think should be taught in high school. Now, let's take a look at a book that I think should be, and that is one that I actually had to read myself in school, which is Animal Farm by George Orwell. I was going to put like 1984 on here because that could work too. But there's some sexual stuff in that I understand, especially in today's climate where you hear on the news all the time of school boards coming under fire by disgruntled parents and being asked to remove certain books from their reading list due to controversial content. And I understand that as a parent, you don't want your kids to you know be exposed to something that they might not be ready to be exposed to. So I'm not going to go with 1984. I'm going to go with the book that I had to read in 7th grade English class, Animal Farm. This is prime high school reading material. It is very short. It is a fable about some animals, but of course, that is not what it's really about. It is an allegory for Soviet Russia and how the communist revolution happened and how it ultimately turned into absolute an absolute nightmare. Yeah, this book is, again, this is great for students in high school to read. It is very simple because George Orwell wrote in a very easily graspable style, so it's not hard to understand. It's got an aura of whimsy about it because it's about talking animals, but there is a bedrock of some very serious ideas and issues and history to this, which makes it have a great deal of significance to it. So this actually belongs in high school reading lists, I believe. Animal Farm by George Orwell. Now let's take a look at another book that I think should not be taught in high school, and this is the book more than any other that I don't think should ever be taught in school, because this book more than any other has the potential to just destroy any future love of literature in students, and that is The Scarlet Letter by Nathaniel Hawthorne. I read this a few years ago, or at least a couple years ago, and I really liked it. Actually, it's not one of my favorite books, but I appreciate it. I liked it. It definitely is a very important book. However, if I had had to read this when I was 14 or 15, I would have screamed, because this is the most boring, tedious, and uneventful book you are likely to encounter. And the fact that any teacher actually thinks that kids out there, any kids out there, would enjoy reading this it's beyond me as to how anyone can think that. This book does not need to be assigned reading in school, because it will kill any love of literature that the kids that are subjected to this uh, might have. The language is really archaic. The sentence structure is insane. I mean, some of these sentences have multiple clauses, multiple sections, lots of end dashes, loads of commas, loads of semicolons. Some of these sentences run on for like half a page at a time, and it's just really hard to appreciate, which I did because I'm an adult now and my sensibilities are a little bit more refined, but there is no reason why this book should ever be given to kids in high school, and the fact that it is just, again, beyond me, because this is what I'm talking about books that can do more harm than good. So you parents out there, if you find that this book, The Scarlet Letter, is on your kids assigned reading list in school, you raise a stink, not because it's controversial or that it has naughty content in it, but because your kids will probably contemplate suicide when reading this boring, tedious little volume. So, no reason why this should ever be taught in high school. Now let's take a look at another book that should be taught in high school, and one that, while I didn't get to read in high school, don't know why, because you would think this one's pretty popular. But this one definitely should be taught in high school, and that is Lord of the Flies by William Golding. William Golding wrote in a very accessible style. The language in this book is not hard to grasp or understand, and the fact that the book is about children, nominally at least, makes this prime material for kids to read, because they can probably see a lot of themselves in it. Again, it's not really about, in a thematic sense, children. It's definitely a very adult-oriented book in what it says about human nature. But the fact that the characters in the book are children makes this, again, prime material for kids to take a crack at. But it's easy to understand. It's exciting. A lot happens in this book. There's death, there's carnage. But then, of course, there are the more philosophical elements to it about the beast that lives in us all, and how it can't really be killed, and how the base barbarism of humanity has a tendency to come out sometimes. And again, this book is just one that I didn't actually get to read this in school. I read this as an adult, but I really wish I had. It's very short. It's not a big time sink. And again, it's first and foremost exciting. It actually has some action to it. Kids can enjoy this, and I think they can get what the book says, and they should get what the book says, because it's very important that they do, because this is a very important book. So, Lord of the Flies belongs, I think. It has a rightful place in classrooms. And now let's take a look at my number one pick of a book that should never be assigned in school, and that would be Hamlet, or really just any Shakespeare, because while I recognize I'm kind of anomalous in that regard, I really enjoyed when we read Hamlet. I think I was in ninth grade whenever we read this, and I really enjoyed it. In fact, I took the copies that we were given were just this copy, same kind of copy, this little Signet Shakespeare edition. And I remember taking that thing home every day after school and perusing the lines of the bard, not understanding one single word of it almost, but knowing that there was something within here that was important. I mean, when we got to the to be or not to be speech, I mean, you heard those words by the time you get to the point of reading this somewhere in your life. And I knew there was something important about Hamlet, but uh, I will be really hard pressed. I would be really hard pressed, I'll say, at that age to say what that actually was, because this is impenetrable for an adolescent, I think. This is what I meant about the language being needing to be something that a kid can reasonably grasp. I didn't understand hardly any of this language. I did not know what a bodkin was. I did not know what a petard was. I did not know what fartles meant. I did not know what the word strumpet meant. And you know, I love Hamlet. I mean, this is a real contender for the title of greatest work of literature ever written. But again, I would have been hard pressed to tell you why in ninth grade reading this, because I didn't understand it. A lot of it, it's brutal trying to read Shakespeare at an age where you're not prepared to read Shakespeare, even if it's like Romeo and Juliet, which you would think, because we had to read that too, you would think that would lend itself more to kids being able to grasp it, especially adolescent and hormonal kids that are, you know, having crushes all the time, and you're reading a story about some star-crossed lovers. But damn, you can't grasp the language in this. And the themes of Hamlet are going to go over the heads of most kids. I just think that I love Shakespeare. I mean, he is the most important author, the most important writer of all time, but I think his work should be restricted to more collegiate settings and not high schools or middle schools, because I don't think most kids, probably 9 out of 10 kids, are even going to be remotely prepared to pick up what the bard was laying down. And I am thankful that the teacher that I had who instructed that class was very passionate about Shakespeare, and he went out of his way to break Hamlet down line by line almost to make sure that we got at least some semblance of the meaning and the import of it. So I am thankful for that, Mr. Harvey. If you ever come across this video, you did have at least one success in that class, because obviously I went on to buy a copy of it myself. And now I really do appreciate Hamlet. I love Hamlet. Again, it is possibly the greatest thing ever written. But again, I wouldn't have known that in ninth grade, because damn, this was an uphill battle, and it was kind of brutal trying to read this. So teachers, why do you insist on teaching Shakespeare to kids who can't understand it and can't even understand why it's so important, really? I mean, leave Shakespeare to the colleges, not the high schools. But anyway, Hamlet, any Shakespeare, it's doing more harm than it's doing good. But if you would like, teachers out there, if you would like a work of drama to instruct your students with that might be a little bit easier to grasp, but still has a lot there to grasp, I might recommend this work, which is Carol Capek's RUR, or Rossum's Universal Robots. This is a play which is responsible for introducing the word robot to the world. This is actually where the word robot comes from, and it is a play about these people who build robots, although what robot actually means in here is a little bit different from what we think of it now. But they build robots, and they make the robots do all their construction and labor. But then one day the robots rise up, because that is what the purpose of robots is in fiction, is about an uprising. And it all started right here. It's a pretty short play. It's not all that long, but the language is far more modern than anything you're going to read in Hamlet. But there are still serious themes here to pick up, not only about human rights and where the line of what can be considered human is actually drawn, but also this is kind of sort of a commentary on much like Animal Farm, the Communist Revolution. And this takes a very impartial look at that. It does not really condemn or praise either side in that conflict. And it's a very heady, cerebral work that I think even high school students should be able to grasp. And so, yeah, I would recommend this if you're going to give a play uh, to your kids to read or stage even. I would recommend this over anything Shakespeare because this is still important. It has a lot to say, but it's far more modern. The kids are going to be able to see much more of themselves and their own world in it, probably. And it's just a lot easier to grasp. And I think this is a safer bet than anything Shakespeare wrote for high school kids. So that has been my take on the teaching of literature in school. I recognize that obviously, as a lover of literature, as a bookworm myself, literature is incredibly important and it needs to be taught. But I think that the way that schools teach literature, again, does more harm than good. Because they're giving you material that you aren't prepared for at that age, much of the time. Um, and so uh, this has been my suggestions as to how that might be remedied. I doubt, obviously, this will have any impact on any school board's decision. If anybody out there, in that kind of position actually sees it, but give it some thought and, give a thought. Literature is about empathy, after all. It's about seeing through somebody else's eyes. And I think a lot of adults out there should try to see through the eyes of teenagers and adolescents and realize that the books that you're cramming down their throat, they are just regurgitating because they can't stomach it yet. They need to be shown the way. And you can lead a horse to water, after all, but you can't make it drink. And so I think that even though the purpose of teaching literature in school is incredibly noble, it's often misguided, and it can impair the potential of students to go on to loving, appreciating, and enjoying literature later on. And so the examples that I have provided here for substitutes of the books that are commonly assigned in school, I think are pretty sound. But yeah, let me know down in the comments what your experience was like in school, what you were assigned to read, whether you loved it, whether you hated it, whether you could even understand it. And as always, if you have enjoyed anything you've seen or heard here today, remember to hit that like button and subscribe. I would really appreciate it. And until next time, peace.